Hi there, Nick here from Conservation Careers and welcome to the podcast. Now, how can we restore biodiversity whilst balancing the needs of people and wildlife? And what can large carnivores teach us about coexistence and environmental harmony? Well, today's guest is Jonny Hanson. He's an environmental social scientist, conservationist and author of Living with Lynx, sharing landscapes with big cats, wolves and bears. Jonny brings a unique perspective to conservation, blending natural and social sciences, peace-building techniques and his experiences across Western Europe and North America. In this episode, we explore the fascinating topic of large carnivore introductions, their ecological and symbolic impacts, and the challenges of coexistence. Jonny also shares his innovative approaches to conservation, lessons from his career journey, and practical advice for aspiring conservationists like yourselves. It's a thought-provoking, multidisciplinary and inspiring pod chat. Enjoy. Yep. And what I'll do is I'll edit an introduction on later, so I won't do any sort of kind of big introduction now. So the easiest way for us to get going, if you're all right, is just to literally just introduce yourself in terms of like name, job title, like quite short.
Yeah, afternoon, Nick and everybody else who's listening. It's great to be on the show. Thank you for having me. So I am an environmental social scientist at Queen's University Belfast, and I study the relationship between people and nature, and in particular how that's mediated through the processes of conservation and the process of agriculture. So that's the day job. It keeps me, pays the bills, keeps me going.
One of many day jobs, and I think we're probably going to dig into that a little bit more through our chat today. There's loads of things we can and probably will talk about. I mean, you've done so many things. You're a jack of all trades. I think you've described yourself
Yes.
as that, and it certainly comes across when I've looked at your career history. Something that's very much timely right now is you've been doing a lot of work and research into the reintroduction of large carnivores in Britain and Ireland.
Mm.
You've got a book out. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but let's just
Yeah.
start from the perspective of what large carnivores should we have within kind of the British Isles, sort of casting the net out wide? Like what's missing right now that should be out there right now? Because I don't think we have any right now. I think I'm right in saying.
No, I guess in historical times, so within the times that we've had people living on these islands, we've had brown bears, we've had grey wolves, and we've had Eurasian lynx. And the discussions about the potential return of these species, particularly lynx, less so wolves because they're a bit more complicated. And as far as I'm aware, no one is actively considering reintroducing bears. But as an umbrella term for large carnivores, the debate is gathering ahead of steam, and it's moving even over the last 10 years that I've been observing it, even before I've become involved in it in the last few years. It's moving from a fringe issue to a mainstream issue.
Mm.
And so it's something that whatever part of the conservation sector that you work in or are aspiring to work in, that we should think carefully about what that involves and weigh up the pros and the cons, the cost and the benefits, and who wins and who loses. There's a lot of things to think about, Nick.
Yeah, there's a lot of balance to be struck. Why do you think the debate is kind of picking up a pace? I mean, it feels to me like linked to rewilding, restoration. It's all part of that kind of bigger process, which has become really popularized and almost mainstream within conservation now. It's an exciting area of growth. What's sped up the debate, particularly around the kind of large carnivores? What do you think's kind of ignited that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it is linked to rewilding, and I'm a big fan of rewilding science. I think it's good to see conservation and nature on the front foot, being proactive as opposed to as it was for much of the latter half of the 20th century on the back foot. It was about sticking fingers in dams, whereas rewilding breaks with that and is much more proactive and at its best is not about some link back to an imagined past, but is creating the ecosystems of the future and reevaluating our place within that. And in terms of creating those ecosystems, although we as a form of apex predator ourselves can replicate the role of predators to an extent. So for example, we can try to hunt and cull deer in order to reduce their numbers and stop overgrazing and overbrowsing, but we can't quite function the way that apex predators do because they don't only suppress the numbers of deer, particularly deer, in these islands, but they also change the behavior of deer, something that's called the landscape of fear. And being in an island that has lost a lot of biodiversity, the notion that these species could have profound and powerful effects on our countryside and on our ecosystems and provide lots and lots of benefits is a tantalizing one. And I think that is the strongest part of the case for having them back, with the caveat that it's not going to be a simplistic wolves change rivers model, which was often what is touted with what happened in Yellowstone. And even in Yellowstone, it was a lot more complex. There were beavers reintroduced at the time that were involved in changing rivers. It wasn't just wolves. So as long as we have that caveat in the discussion, the ecological benefits of these species is a big part of that discussion about rewilding and of the need to restore nature, not just stop losing it.
Mm.
But the second part of that I would add, and my interest as an environmental social scientist, is that these species, particularly lynx and wolves, are not just biological beings, but they're psychological symbols. And so, more than anything else, I would argue that species like this, and in other parts of the world too, not just our islands, that they symbolize wild as an idea, they symbolize wild as a place, and they symbolize through rewilding, they symbolize it as a process of taking it from somewhere that was in the distant past or somewhere that's far away in Africa or Asia, Nepal, the Serengeti, and they bring it into Northern England and Southern Scotland and the west of Ireland.
Mm.
And that symbolism goes in both directions. It can be a powerful, for proponents, that they're symbols of that rewriting the story of the countryside and that vision for nature. But they can equally be symbols of out of out of touch liberal urban elites interfering in the countryside and imposing costs on farmers. These are the sort of things and symbols that we can project onto these animals. So it's also really important in this debate when we think about the growing interest in this that we remember that we're not just dealing with ecological facts, but we're also dealing with social perceptions and that symbolic aspect. We need to consider both at the same time.
Mm. Yeah. You mentioned there's something I've not heard before, which is a landscape of fear. Yeah, and how deer. I immediately start to think, what does that mean for like a deer population when they don't have big predators hunting them? They must be behaving quite differently. So, I guess my question is, how would wildlife populations within the British Isles be different if large carnivores like wolves, like lynx, even like bears actually were just a
Mhm.
native, became part of our native fauna again? Like, what would be different? Pros and cons, but like, what are we missing right now that would suddenly change if they were here, if they were just a naturalized part that we'd accepted?
Yeah, I guess bears, although they are capable of certainly hunting, they are more omnivorous than carnivorous. And I'm
Yeah.
not sure there's been much, even any research that I'm aware that has looked at the potential role, but certainly with wolves, which are pack hunters capable of taking large deer, right up to adult red deer stags, which would be our
Mm.
largest deer species, and then lynx, which are specialist forest dwellers and usually predating on roe deer.
Mhm.
But in the context of Britain and Ireland, we also have then a series of invasive species, some of which are similar in size with muntjac and
Mm.
Chinese water deer. And then getting larger than that, we have fallow and sika as well. And they spend a lot of time eating trees and young trees. And I think foresters in particular probably have some concerns about the damage that they do to forestry operations. And they just eat everything in sight often. And so the role of predators in that is twofold. One, they will actively hunt and eat
Mhm.
deer. They will have that profound role in the ecosystem of changing the deer population by selecting. And whereas we as humans, typically we want adult males with fancy headgear that looks good over the mantelpiece and sounds good over a pint in the pub, whereas apex predators are hunting the weak and the sick and the ill and the young. And so they can create, I believe, and understand healthier populations as well because they're kind of pruning to go back to the tree metaphor. But as you said, there's also then the landscape of fear is part of a broader package of what is called non-consumptive effects. So when they eat deer, they're consuming them. Those are the direct effects. Deer numbers are reduced, but
Mhm.
they also have indirect effects because they are in a landscape. And this was well described in Yellowstone. deer will start to avoid certain landscapes, maybe dense cover, maybe open areas where they're more easily caught. But then it can also have knock-on effects in terms of if they're fearful, they're maybe they're less likely to gain weight or reproduce. And then we see that in livestock as well, which is something we'll get on to later. So that whole package of ecological impacts, even though they're often relatively small numbers of apex predators in a landscape, has a profound and outsized effect. The other technical term is trophic cascades, that just cascades down through the web of life, having this incredible impact and benefit to all the web of life beneath them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting to kind of just to connect to what that world, what we're missing right now, and what it could look like. Yeah. And that's what this is all about, I guess. Um, what would be you talked about balance and sort of, yeah, working with different communities. You just touched on like impacts on on particularly on livestock, and obviously farming, and there's all sorts of pros and cons. What would be the process of reintroduction? Let's say the lynx. I guess that's the sort of the lowest hanging fruit here in terms of potential impacts. Like, yeah, what would the process look like for reintroducing? Yeah, who would you need to engage? Yeah, what steps would you take? Let's keep it sort of general. Yeah.
Sure. And I think it's worth saying there has been one failed attempt to reintroduce lynx
Right.
about 8 years ago. That an effort was declined a license for the north of England, and then there are current projects that are at various stages in also in the north of England and then in Scotland. And in fact, there was a national consultation on lynx reintroductions to Scotland earlier this year, and
Right.
the results early 2024. The results will be out in early 2025. So as we said already, this is picking up pace and moving
Mm,
from fringe to mainstream. But in terms of speaking more generally about good practice for large carnivore reintroductions,
mm,
one element, I guess the baseline is understanding the ecology and understanding, firstly, is there the habitat, so the space to have these animals back. So for lynx, that's forest cover. Secondly, within a landscape, is there the prey base? So are there enough roe deer sized deer in those landscapes to sustain? And also it's about thinking then about that population over a longer period of time. So as it expands, making sure that it's genetically healthy. And some of the most recent work that's been done in the, the north of England and into Scotland, all the way up to the Highlands, is looking at that over 100 years. So looking at habitat, prey, and the genetics over 100 years. And that's really the gold standard for considering a population. And that's really exciting and important work. But in many ways, that's the low-hanging fruit of the low-hanging fruit. That's the easy bit,
mhm,
because the complicated bit is not so much the nature bit of large carnivore reintroductions, it's the human nature bit,
mm,
less the ecology and more the human ecology. Um, Best practice there, in my view, given that I work at this interface between large carnivore conservation and livestock farming, would be always to start, and I would recommend this not just in these islands, but all over the world, is to start with the most affected, which is typically because of real or perceived risk, livestock and landowners, particularly of sheep, which are quite vulnerable to large carnivores of all sorts, bears, wolves, and lynx, and not just to bolt on a consultation with farmers at the end to try and get a license, a reintroduction license from Natural England, which is what happened, in my opinion, 8 years ago, and other people's opinion too. But to really get to grips with the concerns and the perspectives of those livestock owners from the very outset, and to
mm,
build many of the approaches and solutions around their concerns.
mm,
And in my view, we also should, in the same way that we're thinking about the ecology of a reintroduced population of lynx over 100 years, we need to take a similar long-term perspective with the social and the economic and the cultural and the political, the human dimensions as well.
mm,
Because it's one thing to fund a pilot for 5 years and to fund compensation costs for lost sheep in those 5 years, or to fund a suite of what I call the coexistence toolkit, these measures that we can use to protect livestock from large carnivores. But we also need to be thinking, as that lynx population expands over 100 years, how are we going to pay for this over that 100-year period? How are we going to be paying for this in a century? If there are 656 lynx in the north of England and Scotland,
mm,
how are we going to pay for that? And who's going to pay for it? And this also comes down to a big part of reintroductions in the social element is paying even more attention to those who are living closest to it, not just livestock owners. So it's relatively easy for people living in a leafy suburb of Belfast or Dublin or London or Cardiff or Edinburgh to think, isn't this a fantastic idea? And it is a fantastic idea. I love the idea in principle,
Mm.
but in practice, we should think carefully and give particular attention to those whose livelihoods are going to be affected and whose daily routines are going to be changed because they have to fence in a different way or they have to employ livestock guardian animals or they're going to see some of their livestock killed. And also about that symbolic aspect that to some people like that, those changes are not just about changes to daily routines. They can be seen, and I hinted at it earlier, they can be seen as an assault on a way of life.
Hmm.
And that's something that I picked up on my travels across
Mm.
Western Europe and North America. I rarely found people who said, really don't like wolves. I really don't like lynx. They said, I don't want to see my way of life changed. And I resent people from the outside who have never kept sheep or run a farm trying to tell me how to change the way I farm or the way I live or this piece of land that I've had for 6 generations. So
Mm.
starting with those concerns, to me, that is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah. Starting with those concerns, working with local people from the beginning, and also having this much longer term view, this 100-year type vision as well about how these are
Yeah.
going to, how these changes might be implemented and managed. Yeah. So you've got a book coming out. It's called Living with Lynx: Sharing Landscapes with Big Cats, Wolves, and Bears. And you did a bit of an epic rewilding road trip across Western Europe and North America. Like, what was the motivation for the book? Like, why did you decide to write a book in the first place?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've always wanted to write a book. I've just a very creative person. I was not many people know this, but between the ages of 5 and 15, I was classically trained in piano and clarinet and musical theory. So I have this creative element which finds some expression in the social science that I do, but it's statistical analysis and scientific rigor. And what I wanted to do was take all of the scientific knowledge and social scientific knowledge that we're talking about and the historical knowledge that we've hinted at in terms of the history of our relationship with these species in Britain and Ireland and bring that together with just a really good story. A story that makes people laugh, makes people cry, makes people swear, makes people just wonder and think about this and be excited. I wanted to turn it into something that people at the end of one chapter was like, oh my word, I can't believe that happened. How is Jonny Hanson going to survive to the end of the next chapter? Never mind the end of the book in one piece. And what I do, I suppose that the tagline that I have on my website and social media accounts is that I bring the world to life. And I wanted to bring this topic to life by writing a really exciting, popular science adventure travelogue. So I did.
I look forward to reading it. It sounds great. Um, what did you learn then through the book? Like, what would people discover, or what surprised you? So you've spoken to over 50 people, seven
Mm.
countries. There's lots of stories in there, lots of conversations. You've brought that to life. Like, what? Yeah, what surprise elements, or what did you learn through those conversations that people will read about?
Yeah, well, the book's 85,000 words, which sounds like a
Yeah.
lot. Well, it could have been twice that. I really had to be selective, and I guess I learned so many things, but I can distill it down to three main messages. One is that when these animals return, particularly after long absences, it is really challenging, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it. It is challenging. It's challenging for all the reasons we've discussed in the
Mhm.
last 20 minutes. So the first thing is my advice is never lose these species. Never lose them. Do everything we can to keep them in a landscape and not lose them because once you lose them, it's really hard to bring them back. And the longer the time period goes between them last being here and coming back, the harder it becomes because we lose the memory and
Mm.
we get used to putting sheep on a hillside and visiting them once a day and bringing them in after 6 months for the winter or down from the Dales to the lowlands. Um, all of those changes. We don't like change as a species. We like our daily routine and we like our way of life, and we think things will always be as they always are, and they never are, but we think they will be. Um, so I think acknowledging that, I came to write this book as a professional large carnivore conservationist. My PhD was in how do snow leopards share landscapes with people and their livestock and their other activities like tourism. But I hadn't anticipated the challenges of bringing large carnivores, particularly wolves, more so than lynx,
Hmm.
back. And I was a bit taken aback, especially in Europe, in Switzerland and the Netherlands, by the degree of social conflict that the return of these animals can generate, especially when it is poorly managed, whenever we don't factor in all of those human dimensions, and when we don't start with farmers' concerns at the center, when they're tacked on at the end, or to save money, people are only given 50% compensation. So that's one of the big lessons. The other is that in these islands, I've been thinking about this topic for 10 years and actively researching it now for the last two and a bit. Even though I think it is harder than I first anticipated, I think it is more likely. And I think it is gathering pace, as we've already said a couple of times. And strategically, again, we should take a step back and think about this in terms of decades and not just years, because in all the places that I visited, the debate about the return of these species played out over decades and not just years. And strategically, if we think about the strategic factors that are shaping the future of the British and Irish countryside, particularly reforestation in upland areas,
Mm.
less people involved in livestock, including upland sheep farming,
Mhm.
expanding environmental consciousness, particularly in urban and younger voters and consumers, meeting climate change goals through that afforestation, expanding deer populations. We are creating, I think, in the future, whenever that might be, the more and more suitable conditions for these animals return. We're creating the environmental, ecological conditions. We're creating the social conditions. We're creating the economic conditions. And I think at some point, all of these are going to align to facilitate this to happen, most likely with lynx. And if it happens with lynx, it's probably more likely that wolves will happen. And into that mix, I would throw also technological factors, that while these are not a substitute for the fact that conservation is ultimately a relational process. Reintroducing carnivores is a relational process. It's a relational process between people and a relational process between us and other animals and the rest of nature. So technological solutions can't substitute for that, but my goodness, they can certainly help us with that in terms of digital fences with sensors on lynx collars and sensors on sheep collars that set off sirens when lynx come near a field. Those sorts of tools I think will become more readily available and can be actively designed. And so that's the second thing, that it's one is that it's more challenging than anticipated. Two, it's more likely than I anticipated. And the third thing, and this goes way beyond just this argument, these species, and even beyond conservation, is sharing landscapes with large carnivores is also about sharing landscapes with each other. It's about sharing landscapes with people who think differently, look differently, vote differently, who have different visions for the land, different views in the past, the present, the future, different values, different approaches to value, and to what extent money and finance and economics should shape the future of nature. And we need to find ways to share landscapes with each other. And where, as I traveled 29,000 kilometers across Western Europe and North America, talking to people who were at all points in the political spectrum, all walks of life, what I kept discovering is that people really love the places that they live. And this debate gets heated because people really care about the future of the places that they come from. And I think in this highly polarized political, social, and political context that we find ourselves now, that we should remember that when someone disagrees with us on lynx reintroductions or wolf reintroductions or anything else for that matter in conservation or otherwise, that we all really care about where we're from and where it's going and our part in it. And that's a really important piece of common ground to hold on to.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, I love that. You mentioned this is your first book. It's 85,000 words, could have been twice as
Mm.
many. And I feel like there's probably more books in you as well. I'm sort of sensing that. Well, how did you find the writing process? Like, what was that like? Not many of us written books. Was it easy? Did you have a certain time of the day? Like, just talk us through the actual, rigmarole or
Obviously.
joy of writing.
Mm. Yeah, I got into a bit of a rhythm when I started writing, but I should precise that by saying that I had a research assistant who did a lot of the donkey work in terms of when you submit a book proposal to a publisher, you have to come up with a plan and a marketing plan, but also how many chapters and a one-page summary for each chapter, and then you have to have a sample chapter. So starting with that, and then I created a detailed plan for every chapter. And
Mhm.
as I went through, I'd send the detailed plan to my research assistant, and Jack would thoroughly research it and come back to me with a dossier of papers and summaries and abstracts attached to all the different points in the chapters as I went through. Because yes, it's primarily a story, but there's also a lot of science in there. I think that actually both of those go together, the facts and the feelings,
Mm.
the evidence and the emotion, the science and the stories. And what that meant is that when I came to write, I wasn't having to go looking for that reference that I read 6 months ago and go down a rabbit hole in Google Scholar or the internet about what was that, and then I'd find something else. I had in front of me every source that I needed, and I didn't need to go looking for it. So if you think of, to use the equine analogy, a cart horse with blinkers on or just a horse
Mm.
with blinkers on, I was able to focus just on the writing and on crafting beautiful
Mm.
paragraphs and making words meld together. And I got into this really beautiful routine and rhythm where there's 15 chapters, and each is 5 to 6 thousand words approximately. And I got into a rhythm where I'd work from 9 to 1, 3 mornings a week, and I could quite comfortably write a chapter, so 5 to 6 thousand words in that.
Mm.
And there were days when that just flowed out of me, days when it was like pulling teeth. But as a whole, it was a very enjoyable rhythm. And what's interesting, because like I was saying at the start, this is not just a scholarly or scientific process of distilling and aggregating all this knowledge. It's also a creative process because
Mm.
it's bringing this to life. Um, I found that if I went more than 3 days a week, it became a law of diminishing returns. So I could get a chapter and a bit written per week. I could get 1 2/3 written if I worked 5 days. But once I went over 3 mornings a week, just some of the creative spark ebbed away.
Mm.
And so that was one of the big learning points for me in writing this book is you got to pace yourself and you gotta just allow yourself the energy to be creative in the process as
Yeah.
well and just find that rhythm. Others will work differently and that's fine. Everyone has their own routine and rhythm, but that worked for me really
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Do it
Great.
again. Do it again. I
I
will
like
do
the
it again.
structure that you've got. Yeah. And I like the rhythm. And you've obviously learnt when your energy drops and how to
Mhm.
optimize and balance everything. And it sounds like everyone needs, was it a Jack, the researcher? Sounds
Yes,
fantastic.
yes. Everybody does.
Yeah. Let's talk about your career. You've done so
Mm,
many things, and time is relatively short, but I want to try and dig in as much as I can.
sure.
Let's start with your current role, if we can. So you're a research fellow at Queen's University Belfast with a social policy hub called ARC. Yeah,
Mm.
amongst other things. What's your current job like? Like, how do you describe it to your family and friends who have no idea what it is you do day to day? Let's.
Yeah, so well, to also put it in the context of what we've said, and particularly that last point. Well, the first point I said was that large carnivore introductions are really tricky. The second was that they're becoming more likely.
Yep.
And the third was that they're about coexisting with each other. So we need natural science data in that, particularly for that ecological baseline. We need social science data to understand us as people. And often that's quantitative data. So we're looking for numerical patterns in society. What did these 1,000 Scottish people think about Lynx reintroductions? But when it comes to understanding the nuances of human behavior, we also need qualitative approaches that understand that don't just give us that breadth of what 1,000 Scottish people think, but the depth of, in my case, what do 10 rewilding and farming leaders in Britain and Ireland think about this topic. And the final part, which links to what I do these days, is that when it comes to solving those conflicts over large carnivores, over badgers and TB, over climate and just transitions, over many other things, neither quantitative social science nor natural science give us the tools to do that. A lot of those approaches for solving conflicts come from peace building approaches. And of all the parts of the UK or Ireland, Northern Ireland has something of an extraordinary track record because of our peace process. And in my lifetime, the phenomenal progress we've made in making peace. So ARC is fundamentally about the unfolding of the Northern Irish peace process and how Northern Irish society has changed after the ceasefires of the 90s and the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, and how people think, how Protestants think about Catholics, Catholics think about Protestants, how people think about new minority ethnic groups coming into the country, or how people think about the police, all of those sort of things.
Mm.
And my point is this, that when it comes to solving environmental conflicts, we in conservation, we need to take those methodologies from peace building in Northern Ireland and across the world, and we need to apply them to solving environmental conflicts. And so I work in ARC, surrounded by sociologists and social policy wonks and educationalists and all of these different academics who have never studied conservation. And I'm learning about how I can take those peace building approaches and bring them to conservation. But what I also do is bring an environmental angle to their work. Because if you go back in Northern Irish history, if you go back in British history or Irish history, those conflicts that we've had and anywhere else in the world, it's always about land. You go back far enough, it's about who gets to do what with the land, when and where. It's about who controls it. Even these debates, should we have Lynx back or not? It's about who gets to do what with the land. So if you don't have an environmental angle when it comes to understanding the past, the present, the future, then the social policy, the peace building that you're doing will not be fully complete. So at the same time in ARC as I'm learning about peace building and bringing it to conservation, I'm bringing conservation to people who don't generally engage with conservation. And there's a lesson there for me in thinking, you were saying, how do I explain it to my family? But I'm always thinking, how do I make these first year social workers, how do I make them think about biodiversity conservation? What gets them out of bed and what makes them think that they need to engage with the natural world? And it's not always about the intrinsic value of nature, which for me is an integral part of the way that we value the natural world, that has a right to exist independent of our interaction with it. But I think we in conservation need to accept that that's not everybody's starting point. Some people's starting point is, I want good food for my kids. I want a nice house that is warm in winter. I want X, Y, or Z. And so I think conservation needs to also, at the same time as setting up the inalienable right of nature to exist, also needs to find ways for it to slot into people's everyday lives because it provides a green space for them to walk their dog or walk their children, or it provides beauty in an urban environment or an escape to the countryside. And so it's forcing me, being in this social policy unit, to think creatively about how I bring conservation, biodiversity, and the environment to different audiences, both of my fellow academics and researchers, and also to some of the students that I teach. And I guess that's the hallmark of my career, is that I just like to do things differently, and I like a challenge. I don't follow the herd, and there's something to be gained from that sometimes. It's how innovation happens.
Yeah, yeah, and you are innovative for sure. I love what you're saying about, like, what I'm hearing as I'm listening to you through the interviews, want a real understanding of community and of people and of culture and of history, um, and also just a real art of communications, like how to convey messages and speak to people, and that feels like that's all
Mm.
woven into so many threads of how you approach things. You touched on there about innovation as well. I want to talk about that particularly with you and look back at your career steps so far. We've got sort of 10, 15 minutes or so I want to make sure we
Okay.
cover the key bits we have. So let me speak back your history to you
Yes.
for interest of brevity. So you studied medieval history and archaeology at Queen's University Belfast. Medieval history and archaeology, interesting. Then you did business management and sustainability at Queen's University Management School. You then worked in nature education and fundraising. And then, as you've already said, you did a PhD in snow leopard conservation at the University of Cambridge. You then set up some community farms as well, didn't you, as well? So where to go? What do you think? What have been the kind of what's the key thread that brings all that together? Are there kind of skills or connections across that? Because it feels like there's lots of parts, and you're very multidisciplinary. Maybe that's the key thread, is that you don't just do one thing; you do lots. I don't know. When you look back at your career, what's been important to you?
Yeah, I the multidisciplinary is important, but even going back even, to childhood, this I've already referenced it with all the music that I did, but I grew up between two Irelands. I grew up between the Republic of Ireland and North of Ireland, moving back and forth between cultures. I didn't really feel like I was either British or Irish. I came to feel that I was both. But then also in preschool and high school, I lived in Malawi in Southern Africa. So I grew up between multiple cultures, and that was not always easy as a teenager when your point of reference is constantly shifting. But as it relates to my career, the golden thread that runs through it is as I grew up between worlds, what I do now is I build bridges between worlds. I build bridges between natural science and social science,
Mm.
between the conservation humanities and the conservation sciences, between conservation and agriculture, between large carnivore reintroductions and livestock conservation, between social policy wonks and social workers and the environmental space and environmental NGOs. And in a world that so often is about building walls, then I think we need people to build bridges. And we need it in conservation too, to widen what conservation is. Like conservation to me, it's a social process. It's something that is done by people to, with, and for nature based on vision and values and value. It's not, as I talk about in the book, a series, not just at least a series of science experiments held together with string. It is a big tent social process. And that tent in the UK has often been limited, limited by class, limited by race. And I think conservation will be stronger when we make that tent bigger and we invite people in and people who bring different ways of thinking about and valuing nature and relating to it. And so when I set up and ran that community farm, which was again about building that bridge between conserving land and also farming land, producing food and maintaining food in landscapes for wildlife, one of the things that we did was expand the remit of who was involved in that place, that piece of land, to not just be the middle class and people who were doing fairly well and could afford the food we did, although we needed and valued people like that. They were a big part of the project. But 2 days a week, we also had referrals from the NHS of adults with learning difficulties. And we also set up the first pilot of its kind in Northern Ireland, which was a project to work with refugees and asylum seekers. And involve them in, yes, the agricultural side, but also the conservation side and the two together. And that, again, is building bridges, inviting people into the conservation tent who perhaps have been excluded before. I think conservation will be stronger and better and more diverse biologically when it is stronger and better, more diverse culturally and socially as well.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, I absolutely see that golden thread. Described it brilliantly. Yeah. You may feel you've answered this, but I'm going to ask it again anyway, just in case. Because yeah, we as conservationists, as wildlife conservationists, we're winning some battles, but we're largely losing the war globally. We are seeing worrying declines in species and ecosystems and habitats across the planet. What do you think we as a conservation sector need to do more of or be better at to have more impact? Like what can we do to really dial it up and actually really to see nature coming back at scale and at the speed that we require?
Yeah, I suspected you might ask me this question, so I was thinking about this. Two things stand out. I'll say the one first and then the second one, which has a slightly controversial example that We'll see what your listeners think of it. The first one I think is the importance of governance, and particularly when I think about snow leopard conservation in Nepal, or particularly with large carnivore reintroductions to Britain and Ireland, that governance is the foundation on which a lot of these things sit, in that it's a forum and a mechanism to bring people together at multiple scales, whether it's the local, at the village level, right up to the global level. And I think are seeing a worrying fraying of global governance, which doesn't bode well for biodiversity or climate or for many other things at the moment. And it troubles me, and I don't have a fix to that other than to say I think governance is really important, because when it's conservation becomes a bigger tent with more people, or we're wanting to reintroduce a species to a landscape, having ways turn to make sure that conservation is based on conversation is absolutely essential. The other thing, and this is why I went to business school, and it's why I'm a passionate entrepreneur. I'm pro innovator and pro entrepreneur more than being pro or anti-market or pro and anti-government. I believe in supporting innovative people. And after setting up the community farm, I ran an accelerator that helped others to do the same. But I say this a lot in the book. It keep coming back to it, that ecology and economy both have the same Greek root word, which is oikos, which means home. And the fundamental goal for me of this century that will solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the pollution crisis and many others is to make sure that the oikos of ecology and the oikos of economy work in synchronicity instead of segregation. So that instead of this linear economy where we take, make, and discard, we discard species, we discard ecosystems, we discard people, we discard the climate. That instead of that linear model, we have a circular model where we take, make, and regenerate. And this is where we get into the role of money and economics and finance and conservation. I think we don't have the luxury of not using that, with the caveat that we as a species have a fondness for finance that can lead us into very dark places. So we have to have that caveat and caution in mind. But I was thinking about this example. I'd be interested to hear what your listeners think about this, and hopefully I won't get into trouble with the bat police. But with the HS2 project, which I'm not going to get into the wrongs and the rights and the ins and the outs, but I was just reading that I think there was 100 million spent on a bat tunnel somewhere on the HS2 line. And again, hopefully the bat police won't come knocking on my door when I say this, but I was thinking that imagine if that 100 million, instead of building a tunnel, had been spent on investing in nature restoration projects across the UK. That this is where I'm getting into biodiversity net gain. I think there would have been a net gain for bats overall as multiple bat species and for bat populations, but also that 100 million and getting the financing right for conservation is going to be really, really important. So that's just a little slightly controversial example to get people thinking. But what that also gets us thinking about, and this relates back to governance, and to finish really quickly with this, is that involves trade-offs. Can we always say no to every project, or are there some projects that have to happen, but we can actually have more nature conservation in other areas? It's a tricky topic, Nick. There'll be many opinions on that, but we need to get that ecology and that economy working together.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something we've talked a lot about on this podcast too, and something I believe quite passionately as well is, the role of the charity sector, for instance, is incredibly important and done such great work, but we need something beyond a charity sector model if we're going to, save the planet. We can't just save it on spare change and donations. We need an economic model that drives that growth, that links to business and prosperity, for all people. So I'm totally with you on that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
As we sort of start to wrap up, few general questions, if I may. One is a lot of our listeners, and we've got some people listening here who'd love to ask their questions once we've finished our recording, are aspiring conservationists, their career switchers, looking to switch their career from whatever they're doing to now working wildlife conservation, or they're students, job seekers looking to get their first job. What sort of careers advice would you give people who are looking to kind of start their career in wildlife conservation? Are there any things that people should bear in mind or might help them through your experience?
Yeah, there are. And I remember, it may not sound like it now, but I remember being in that place myself many years ago. So I've been through it. And two things helped me. One was I spent all my university summers working with as many different projects and species as I could all over the place, all over Britain and Ireland, all over the world. So depending, and that'll be easier if you're an unattached student as opposed to perhaps if you're switching careers and you have a family and commitments, that's obviously going to be different. But even in your spare time, try and get practical experience particularly in an area of conservation that you're interested in. That definitely helped me also know what I didn't want to do, what I did want to do. It confirmed that I wanted to spend the rest of my life working with big cats. And 20 years later, well, 18 years later, here I still am doing that. The other aspect I would say is don't be afraid to not follow the herd. Don't be afraid to do it differently than everyone else is doing it. So the standard conservation approach is do zoology, conservation biology masters, and then work in conservation. But because conservation is a social process, we need zoology and biology, but we also need philosophers and economists and entrepreneurs and doctors and vets, theologians, you name it, financiers, you name it, we need it. So particularly if you're coming to this as a mid-career professional with a career already, think about how you can leverage the skills and career you've had so far to bring something innovative and unique to the conservation sector. Look where the gaps are and look where the problems are and say, how can my career solve the problem that conservation has? So I'm trained as a historian, as an entrepreneur, and a social science. And conservation has gaps in social science, enterprise, and history. So I am able to fill those gaps that are there. If, on the other hand, you're starting out, I would strongly advise that you don't just do the same old, which is nothing wrong with it, but I would say at some point along the way, make sure that you study other subjects. Even if it's part of your degree, do a minor in anthropology, do a minor in geography, do a minor in music, do whatever it might be. Upskill yourself because the world in all its richness and wonders does not just fit into these little academic silos that the Victorians gave us in the 150 years ago. It is so much broader than that. And so in conservation alone and in any other space, we can't just expect one discipline to have all the answers, never mind ask all the right questions. So build bridges between subjects, and that will help you to build bridges in conservation.
Brilliant. And that theme of bridges comes back again at the end. Lovely. Jonny, it's been such a nice chat. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing your time with us here today. Your book, Living with Lynx, Sharing Landscapes and Big Cats, Wolves and Bears, is out February the 11th. And it's we'll drop links below this. Thanks for your time. If people want to find out a bit more about your work, if people want to find the book, where should we send them? Where should they go?
You can go to my website, jonnyhanson.com, and I have a quarterly newsletter. I won't spam you every week or every month, but every quarter you'll get an email about what I'm up to, and I'm on most social media channels at Jonny H. Hanson.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Jonny. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, everyone. If you did, then please do hit the subscribe button to get notified of new episodes as they drop. And also, please give us a rating or a review because it really helps us to get in front of more people, and we really enjoy reading them all. As you'll have heard, our podcasts are now recorded in front of a live audience who sit in and listen to the chat, and then after the mics are turned off, they get a chance to talk to the host, to share their thoughts, and also to ask questions. It's a really great format. If you'd like to be in the audience, all you need to do is join the Conservation Careers Academy. Now, in the Conservation Careers Academy, you'll get full access to the world's biggest conservation job board, listing over 15,000 jobs, volunteer and internships across the globe each year. You'll also enjoy access to our amazing CC Pro private members community with regular events, networking and support. Plus, you'll get full access to our growing library of career-boosting resources, guides and templates. And best of all, it only costs a few dollars, euros or pounds per month to join the Academy. Now, to find out more, please visit conservation-careers.com/academy or simply click the join button at the top of our website. See you on the inside.